Welcome everybody, this is Jeff Fowler with the Apartment Owners Association. It is great to have you with us today. We're going to be talking about inflation, taxes, and the potential coming chaos. And so with all of that, is that the right time to sell, and then how that relates to doing a 1031 exchange into a Delaware statutory trust. So before we get into that, thank you for joining us. AOA's been around for over 40 years. We have a money-back guarantee. If you've never been a member, in your first year of membership, you can get a full refund in that first year if you aren't happy with it. And we're trying to provide a lot of different resources and information that you need to stay ahead of the game. And are we doing all right? Okay, great. And yeah, so one of those is tenant screening. And we have a new criminal search that is kind of works around a lot of the obstacles that have been put up with the way they've redacted information from the court files. And anyway, so we talked about that yesterday. We had a Zoom meeting, and you can catch that if you log into your member account. Under videos, that video will be there. It's not there yet. We're going to get it posted by next week. So next week, check that out for sure. And there's a lot of new things happening there, but we're going to give you as the best information that we can, and yeah, great reports. So definitely use those if you're not using them. And then as far as things that we have going on, this coming Tuesday the 29th, we will have a hybrid meeting. It will be in person and online. And so that one is at the Santa Monica Playhouse. It's at 6:30 at night. So catch that one. And then October 30th, with 3 days in a row. Next week on the 30th, we will have a Prop 33 live stream, and there will be a little legal Q&A at the end where it'll be Attorney Edrin Shamtov that is speaking on that one. And then the very next day is Halloween, and we will have a tricky tenant frequently used tricks seminar, and that'll be online as well. So you can register for those, and that'll help. And then in person, November 19th, we're going to be in Hawthorne doing a tenant screening update. And then November 20th in San Diego, we'll be doing a tenant screening update and have a landlord tenant attorney speaking. And that tenant screening update in San Diego is a little more unique. We actually have an attorney that represents landlords in the types of lawsuits that relate to not giving people the right documents when you're doing the tenant screening. And so that one might be worth traveling to. We might videotape that one, but not sure that we will. But there's a lot of room in that one. The room seats, I think, a couple hundred people. So you're welcome to come down. Man, there's a Dock House Cafe. You could go there before the thing starts and have a incredible lunch, and with us, we'll all be there, and then you could attend that. All right, so a shout out to H&S Wealth today for sponsoring this meeting. They focus on 1031 exchange investments, and of course they do a lot of other things as well, the traditional wealth management. And for over 20 years they've been working with AOA. I know that, and they have a lot of great reviews, and I've yet to receive a complaint on them, that's for sure. And today our speaker, he is a partner with Bob Hoarding at H&S Wealth, and he is a real estate and securities professional since 2004. So, wow, it's 20 years. 20 years he's been doing it. So, go ahead, Bryan, take us away. Adam, Bryan.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I appreciate that. I got to qualify something as far as no complaints. If you talk to my wife, you might hear some, but no client complaints. So yes, my name is Adam Bryan. My company is H&S Wealth Management. I'm what's called a registered representative technically but commonly you would say a financial advisor. I don't deal though with stocks and bonds so much. I've made 100% of my practice over the last 10 years strictly Delaware statutory trusts for 1031 exchanges, and the prior 10 years I was doing that as well, along with some other things. I've been around a long time, again, in the industry over 20 years. I've been involved in somewhere around $250 million in investment into these types of investments, many hundreds of clients. I've actually been involved indirectly as a manager overseeing a team in over $500 million. So have quite a bit of experience, have seen a lot of transactions. I like to say I've been through the good, the bad, and the ugly in the real estate market, the 2008 crash, COVID, the run-up in 2002 to 2007 in valuations. So I've been around the block a little bit. What I wanted to talk about today are whether or not you should still be here, at least as far as your investment real estate is concerned, maybe even your own residence. But really, there's a big question. We're seeing so many challenges in California. Is it the right time to go? A comment briefly on the election. I know a lot of folks are sort of waiting for that outcome, having been through, oh gosh, I guess I'd have to count 10 or so of these elections and a little bit fewer while I've been in the industry. It kind of doesn't matter. There's so many factors that go into valuations tied to the interest rates, of course, the inflation rate, the cap rates, which is the way real estate is valuated, and none of this is directly impacted by any president. So ultimately, that's really not a factor in this decision, whether or not to sell, whether or not to leave the state. Why would you stay in California? I'm California born and raised, I have to confess. I've lived in the San Fernando Valley, in West Los Angeles, in Orange County, in Long Beach. Basically, I've always lived about 2 miles from the 405 freeway, and I will be 60 years old this month. So I've been around the block, so to speak, for quite a while. And I know California, and I love California. I'm not going to trash it. I'll mention, of course, our weather, which we all know is the best, arguably, in the country. And the culture is diverse, the cuisine, our beaches are wonderful. And, you know, the biggest thing about California, the reason I've stayed here my whole life, is because, you know, in the morning in California, you can surf the beach in Malibu. And in the afternoon, you can go up to Big Bear and ski in the same day. Isn't that amazing? In 60 years of life, you know how often I've done that? Never. In fact, I've never skied or surfed. But I live here because I can do those things. And that is one of the huge positives that's very different than the rest of the country. Why would you leave California? Well, you know, a lot of this I think you've been hearing about and reading about. I will just touch on it. But there are a number of factors that is driving folks and businesses out of the state of California. First one I would argue is the pro-tenancy leaning of the state and the local municipalities favoring tenants perhaps excessively. We just got through COVID. We just got through the lack of ability to evict for non-payment. That's actually finally starting to work its way through the courts. And there's a whole slew of new laws that have been implemented in 2024. And of course, we have the ballot coming in November. But to touch on a few things that you may or may not be aware of, the Tenant Protection Act is capping rate increases at 10%, even if market value is beyond that. And that's a watchword for you to make sure you're keeping your rates up with market value. Otherwise, what tends to happen is you just renew your tenant. They're a great tenant, hopefully. They don't cause problems, and pretty soon they're paying 50% of market value. So that's a little tip for you. But right now, the way the state has implemented a 10% cap. We have Prop 33 coming up on the ballot. That could allow local states and municipalities and counties to implement things like rent control. That sounds like a bad thing, and it is in a lot of ways. It's a complex measure. I'm not qualified to speak on it, but I can tell you it doesn't make much sense, and people on the left and the right and the tenants advocates and the landlord advocates like the AOA, nobody likes this proposition. It's very mired in confusion, and it's not going to benefit anyone. And I can tell you, having been in the real estate industry for 22 years, developers are not going to develop land and create more housing if they can't make a profit. It's pretty straightforward. What else is there? Little things. You know, if you own more than 2 properties or 4 units in total, you can only charge 1 month's rent for security deposit. You can do 2 months if you're under that threshold, but that's a requirement now in the state of California for all municipalities. There are no more no-fault evictions. You need to show cause. And that's, the tenant doesn't need to show you cause when they leave, but you need to show them cause if you want them out when their lease is up. If you decide you want to move into your home, your rental, and make it your home, you're allowed to do that, of course, but you can not put that property on the market as a rental for 12 months. And if 6 months into your new residency things change, you're going to lose 6 months worth of income. That again is a California statewide prohibition. If you're going to remodel a unit and you need to get the tenant out while that happens, you need to show them all complete plans. A lot of folks don't realize that as well. You can't not look at a tenant's credit report if they're on Section 8, if they're getting housing aid. That is no longer allowed, and you can't require it. That would be considered discriminatory. And what else? Oh, the application fee. Maybe between your background check and your tenant application costs and all of that, if it's more than $62.02, you're not allowed to charge more this year. That is the cap. So if yours is $75, then you're just going to have to eat that cost. A lot of things when the landlord-tenant relationship is looked at, obviously in California, tends to lean for the tenant and not the landlord, even if it's a relatively small landlord like most of our members are here. Let's talk about inflation. We've heard a lot about it. It peaked around 9% during COVID or just after COVID kicked in. It has been winding down, whether that's because of the Fed increasing rates or not. I guess the historians will tell us. I can tell you that the national average right now of inflation is 2.4%. The goal for the Federal Reserve and what's considered a strong, good economy or good rate is 2%. So we're still a bit higher, 2.4, 20% higher than we want to be, but we're getting there, and that's a good thing. What about California, though? And I did statewide numbers since we have Northern and Southern California members. Statewide, California is still at 3.5%, quite a bit higher than 2%, and you notice about 50% higher than the rest of the nation. So we are still experiencing inflation much harder than others. In 2023, we were 4.2%. One thing I like to remind people when they think about inflation and they hear about the number going down, remember that that's the percent of acceleration. In other words, each year, how much are things going up? If they've already gone up 20% in many cases, whether it's food or gas, et cetera, or insurance premiums, then that doesn't mean it's going back down. It's just not growing at a rate. So we still have very high prices as a result of the inflation over the last few years. I mentioned insurance premiums have gone up dramatically for a number of reasons all across the country. And in fact, in California, partly because of fires and other factors, we're seeing many insurers leaving the state or not writing or renewing new policies. Specifically, I looked it up. I can tell you the names: Tokyo Marine, Trans-Pacific. You may or may not know, but State Farm and Allstate, I'm sure you've heard of, don't want to write policies in California. A lot of reasons. And then lastly, taxation. We all know that taxes are high in general and certainly in California. What you may not know is that we're number one, and California is number one in a lot of ways. We are the most populous state, about 40 million people. You just need to look at the 405 at 4 o'clock to know that. And also, we have the highest tax rate in the nation and the highest that it's been in California historically. In California, you at the maximum could be taxed at a rate of 14.4%. Right now, the federal max income tax is at 37%, and when the Tax and Jobs Act if it expires, it'll go back up to 39.6%. So very high taxes here in California. Okay, all of that said, is it the right time to sell? Well, and get out of California? I can't give you the answer to that question because ultimately there is no right or wrong answer. It's a decision that you have to make for yourself. If you're looking at where the market is, I can tell you that the real estate valuations have held, even with all this inflation, regulation, everything I've just described, good and bad. The net impact is that value of real estate in California has continued to rise. There's not a lot of places you can build without going very far out, which is very expensive. And of course, it's very desirable. We did have negative population growth in 21, 22. In 23, it came back just barely. But it's an issue as far as people coming into the state and the need for more housing. Right now, it's kind of static and flattening out. But as people are not selling, there's not very many properties on the market. That's probably right now with yourself. You may feel that it's not a good time to sell if you have a mortgage because you've locked in a very low mortgage rate. And if you were to do a 1031 and reacquire real estate, you have to assume as much debt as you pay off. Your mortgage is going to increase dramatically in some cases. Therefore, people aren't selling. When people aren't selling, basic supply and demand, what happens to prices? They go up. And that's continued to happen. That being said, maybe you just had your second grandchild and you want to spend more time with them, or you're finally getting your handicap down in your golf game. My point is it's a personal decision. It really isn't about good or bad California, good or bad where the market is. It depends on you, and it's not my job to tell you that. I want to help you make the right decision, the best decision for you and your family, but that's not something that I can dictate. I know a lot of people will tell you, got to get out. All this regulation is killing us. You got to stay. We want to hold this real estate for 20 years, even though you may be gone, for your heirs. All of these are personal decisions. So let's talk about whether or not you sell is up to you, but what do you do if you sell? Well, a 1031 exchange, and I'll go ahead and, there we go, ultimately enables you to defer your taxes, and ultimately you can defer your taxes forever, meaning until you pass away. Your heirs, the way the law is now, receive a step up in basis, which means essentially the tax liability you've accumulated dies with you. It also makes sense to keep your money in real estate in general and to keep it in cash flowing real estate so it's producing income for you. But most folks, they say, you know, should I sell or shouldn't I? If I do, I don't want to be in the same area I just sold in. All these challenges in California aren't going to go away if you sell and buy in California, obviously. You can go out of state, but you become an absentee landlord, which has many challenges. And then the other option, of course, is to pay your tax. What is that? Well, it varies a little bit for everybody, but I can tell you if you look at your basic gain, you bought the property for $100,000, you sold it for $1 million, you basically have about a $900,000 gain. Most folks, when you look at their returns overall, are paying about a third. In that example, $330,000 in taxes. That's just kind of the norm. You know, it comes from a 20% federal capital gains tax, a 3.8% Medicare federal tax, a 25% depreciation recapture tax, and again in California, I mentioned 14.4% is the highest rate, over $1 million gain. It adds up to about a third of whatever you're walking away with, and that money is not coming back. And you don't need to just earn 30% to get back to even, remember, because now you're starting at a much lower number. So financially, unless you need the capital, the cash, generally it makes sense to keep exchanging. But there is the option to cash out or to do a partial exchange, pay some tax, and still buy new real estate. But maybe you want to get out of real estate. Again, you want the grandkid time and the golf course time. Well, then most people say, well, I'm either going to own and buy something or I'm going to pay this huge tax. There is a third option, and most people are not aware of it, even very sophisticated real estate investors. The government keeps securities, private securities, not traded on an exchange, with a very high threshold. They want folks that are accredited investors. That means you have $1 million net worth or greater. They do not want to advertise. They don't want to see infomercials about these Delaware statutory trusts or DSTs. But it is a product that was recognized by the IRS in 2004 as essentially buying real estate for 1031 purposes, for tax purposes, for income tax, for depreciation. It's effectively like you own a piece of real estate, but you own a small portion of a very large asset, or assets, plural, $50 million apartment buildings. Let's take a look at a few. You get the idea. 400, 300 units, could be an Amazon distribution center. I tend to avoid single tenant type properties or retail properties or office properties. Really, we focus primarily on high-end multifamily apartments and self-storage facilities. They've held up the best in different economies. You can own 0.1% of 2 or 3 of these assets with your $1 million instead of one 2-unit building. In Brentwood, or I guess that wouldn't be Brentwood, would it? In Torrance. That's the concept. Of course, because it's such a large asset and there are other investors in the property, you're not taking care of it, you're not voting, you don't have partners, you just own your piece of it. And what's called the sponsor, the investment company that puts the offering together, they're the trustee of this Delaware statutory trust. They take care of the property for the investors. We'll talk about the sponsor a lot. Ultimately, it's an investment company that sources the property, which is not easy to do, finds a good investment, has the financial ability to acquire the property, arrange any financing, and each acquisition is separate under a new trust. In other words, this is not a REIT, R-E-I-T. This is not a stock in a company. This is true pure ownership of real estate, and the first owner is the sponsor, who is also the trustee of this newly created trust. They put the offering together, they make sure it's leased up and operate it, and they go out to what's called the independent broker-dealer network to raise capital, to pull their down payment, if you will, back to them so they can go on and continue acquiring properties. That's their business model. If they just held the property and owned it, then they wouldn't really be an investment sponsor, they'd be an owner-operator. It makes sense to buy any type of real estate in this model, but again, you're still buying real estate, so you do want to stick with what I would argue are safer asset classes. There's only a single borrower when there is a loan, and banks love that. And what that means is that you, as the investor in a DST, you own a portion of the DST. You get your share of the loan, which again you may need for 1031 purposes, but you're not directly on the loan. In fact, ironically, the bank doesn't even know your name. They don't know who you are. They know the legal entity, they know who the sponsor is, and the sponsor signs any guarantees or carve-outs or requirements. So what that means is it's a non-recourse loan to you. And again, you need that loan if you are doing an exchange and you paid off a loan. Plus, you will get the depreciation benefit of the real estate that you're acquiring with the loan. You'll get a better return when the property sells in the future because of the financing. And you get the interest deduction, just like you would if you were on the loan directly. All the same benefits flow through to you as a co-owner. They sell off what are technically called beneficial membership interests. That's your piece of the property or properties, and 100% of expenses, distributable cash flow, appreciation upon future sale flows through to you. In other words, if you put up 1% of the money, let's use simple numbers, you're entitled to 1% of the distributed cash flow. 1% of depreciation on the property will flow through to your tax return. When the property sells, and there's appreciation, you'll get 1% of that appreciation. It's meant to be almost like pure co-ownership. But there's an advantage to it. You can have quite a few members and buy something much larger. People often want to know what's the cash flow. It depends and it varies property to property. In general, with prices where they are, very highly appreciated, interest rates where they are, yes, the Fed came down 0.5 point, maybe will come down another 0.5 point this year. We're still highly elevated. We're in the 6% range. I believe the average for a home right now is 6.34%. It had come down, and because of where the Treasury bond rate went, it went back up again. Our sponsors are paying more like 6%, 6.25%, but relatively, high compared to recent years. Historically, not that high, by the way, I have to mention. And leverage, the amount of debt that they're using, that the lenders are giving, it's actually historically low, and I would argue kind of ridiculously conservative. I'm all for being cautious with debt and not having too much. That's what got us into trouble in the 2000s there, in the late 2000s and the teens. But they're looking at like 30-40% loan to value. You're putting 60-50% down or in that range. Cash flow or net cash flow is a result of all these factors based on the type of properties we're recommending. In the early years, around 4% net cash on cash, climbing up to maybe 6% in the later years. That's after the property manager's paid the taxes, the insurance, if they're giving concessions, all the things that go into managing a property effectively. It's simple numbers again. If you put in $1 million and you're getting a 4% cash on cash return, you're getting $40,000 a year in net cash flow. And you're able to take deductions and depreciation against that 4% or $40,000. And you're probably paying tax on maybe half of that. Again, it's a complicated calculation that your CPA does. There is no steadfast rule, but that is, again, where most people land because you are sheltering your income, one of the benefits of owning real estate, as you know. That happens in a DST just like it would in any other real estate. It mentions here about 499 investors. Don't think that you're in partnership with these other people. You don't know who they are. They just own the same thing as you, kind of like other people own Apple stock, but you don't have any relation to them. Ultimately, the sponsor manages the property, takes care of it, manages the investors. But I mention the 499 max that the IRS allows because it enables very low minimum investments. You can put in as little as $100,000 and buy 5 properties with $500,000 in cash equity. It's a great way to diversify your risk. And normally you're only able to buy, certainly in California, 1 property with $500,000. And if you put on another loan, let's say for another half, you've got $1 million. Now maybe you can get a duplex or a triplex, depending on which part of the city or the state you're in. But it's a great ability to diversify risks geographically, by asset class, and by sponsor company. You're not tied to any one firm. I should mention H&S Wealth Management. We're advisors. We're hired guns. We're not betrothed to any individual sponsor. We have relationships. We've worked with many of them for many years, but we're very particular, and we do like to diversify our clients' risk by all those factors, including sponsors, so that you're not relying just on one company to take care of your portfolio. Right now, there's about 43, 44, I think I read, sponsors that are doing these types of securities, DST investments. Our practice, our firm, we only are working with about 6 or 7 of them, and that's just because they meet our standards, which I'll talk about in a minute. The biggest advantage of a DST is probably the biggest disadvantage as well, and it's the same thing, the issue of control. Most of you out there, you've worked hard, you've been entrepreneurial, maybe you're handy and you've done repairs yourself, built up your portfolio to multiple properties perhaps. You've called the shots and you've done well, especially if you've owned in Southern California. In a DST, you become a passive investor, and that's a blessing and a curse. You're not going to make the decision when to sell the property or what color to paint the building if it's being repainted or when to stripe the parking lot. The companies, the sponsors and their subcontractors, they're experts at managing this type of property. They're going to make the most effective decision for the benefit of the investors. But some people aren't comfortable with that, and I understand that. I can tell you their track records. I can tell you about my other clients that have been working with these firms, get you comfortable with who they are, what their background is, etc. But I understand that that's a challenge. And if you're not ready to let go of control, I'm not going to talk you out of it. And you've obviously done well if you own Southern California apartments or rental units. But that's probably it. Now, on the positive side, you're not going to get a call from a tenant. You're not going to have to negotiate with a vendor. You're not going to have to show up at 4 a.m. because of the diaper that got flushed. I don't know why that's such a common problem, but it is. Or have the termite inspector come out. All of that goes away. It's what we like to call armchair income, completely passive. You don't have to manage these properties. And I got to tell you, to some people, that's the best thing they ever heard. They don't want to make decisions. And both things, again, are okay. It just depends on the individual. But that's how a DST functions. And really, somebody has to be in charge. Another question I get, how long am I going to own this thing? Well, it depends. It varies. Typically, the loans for investment real estate are 10-year terms, so probably it will sell very likely within 10 years. On a long enough timeline, the average hold time has been about 7 years. That's just usually when a market turns, when you bought it at whatever price, where we're maximizing the return, and that's when the sponsor will go out to the market. I can tell you in recent years, and say the last 10 years, they've been selling in about 5 years on average. Just been a quicker cycle, and the reason for that is the appreciation. They basically hit the number that they thought was right. They decided they had enough offers. It was time to sell. And we've been seeing some pretty healthy returns in recent years. Obviously, in the Great Recession, there were a lot of challenges, but I can tell you that no Class A multifamily properties went back to the bank, had a major problem or foreclosure, and no self-storage facilities. In fact, self-storage improved through the Great Recession. So that's why we stick with those asset classes. But the quick answer is I can't tell you how long it'll be, but typically 7 years, more recently 5, and it really just depends where the market goes. Liquidity is a big issue. People want to know if they can get their money out. Well, technically, this is a little bit of a complex answer that I'll try to make simple. Firstly, the SEC and the federal government, they consider all real estate and DSTs as illiquid. That means you can't push a button and sell it on a daily traded market. So it's not a liquid investment. Of course, we know that you can go to a broker, AOA has a great brokerage team, and list and sell your property, but that's not the same as a liquid investment that you turn into cash, right? DST is no different. It is illiquid. There is no secondary market like there is for real estate in general, for people buying secondary interests. But there are people out there that want to leave early, want to get their money out before the whole DST property sells. There's a provision in each offering where all the other co-investors, usually there's about 200, less than 200, they almost never need 499 because they raised the money. They have the right of first offer. You do not have to sell to them. You decide what price you want to sell it at. And if you can come to terms with either a fellow co-owner who knows the property, who's an accredited investor, probably did a 1031, most people investing in these things are doing exchanges, they're the ideal customer for you, the ideal market that you're going to sell to, but you could potentially sell it to the outside world. I can tell you that if you find that buyer, and that's a big if, it's actually a very simple transaction. It's really just a conveyance of a piece of paper. The money moves to your accommodator if you're doing an exchange out of the DST, which you can do, or to your bank account. And that's it. They suddenly now own more of the asset and you own less or none of it if you sell the whole thing. I tell folks, though, not to think of it as a parking vehicle. You know, you're in this for the long haul, if you will, and that's okay. Most people are holding their real estate actually quite a bit longer than that, and really they're not maximizing their return or their cash flow. But that's the way that they structure it, and these again are professional management companies that are going to make the decision when the time is right, meaning they're maximizing the return for their investors. Now, I mentioned that there's about 42 sponsors, and we work with 6 or 7 of them, and that we have standards. Let me go through that, because that is so important. There's certain things to remember. Number one, who am I? Sure, we're your advisor. We get paid through the deal a commission, just like a real estate broker would in any transaction, and our fee works out about the same, to around 3%, and it's built into the price you pay, so there's no charge to you directly in any of our services. All the sponsor companies out there, they vary. They have, many of them, very little experience. They're relatively new. Some of them have been around, 40 years, 50 years. Others are 2 or 3 years in. Well, we're particular. We want to deal with the experienced ones. It doesn't guarantee anything, but when you're dealing with a company that's gone full cycle, put an offering together, sold interests, and operated it for some period of time and then sold it, that's what I want to see. Also, there's a lot of sponsors that will deal particularly with single tenant, triple net, retail, office, student housing, senior housing, all asset classes I have experience with, and just for the sake of time, I'll tell you, avoid them. Now, there's always an exception to everything, of course, but in general, the high-end Class A multifamily within 10 years of construction is what some people call Class A, or self-storage facilities have held up the best. So that's what we're focusing our clients on, and hence the sponsors that are offering those types of DSTs. That's why we're narrowed down. We really kind of weed through the chaff to find the right properties for our clients. Second thing to remember, it's real estate. Like I said, high-end multifamily self-storage holds up the best. Looks to be that it'll continue to hold up the best. And so that's what we focus our clients on. Location, and what's that third rule that they teach you? I forget. Obviously the most important thing. Most of these assets are in the southeast of the United States. That's where jobs are moving, growth is happening. Like I said, California barely grew last year, but in Tennessee and North Carolina and Florida and Texas, Georgia, Washington, D.C. These are markets where we're seeing growth. And, a lot of people worry about the weather. They're highly insured assets, and they're usually brand new, so they withstand wind up to 500 miles an hour. It's really not a major concern. And then where is the growth happening as far as jobs? Because ultimately everything leads to people need employment. And when you do look at these states, you'll see that their job growth numbers are growing. Here in California, we're dwindling, flattening out. That makes a difference. And what kind of neighborhood are you in? The easiest way, if you live in Southern California, you know that you don't necessarily want to own in South Central LA in a low-income area. You want to live in, own property in Brentwood, a high-income area. Well, by looking at the median income in an area, it tells you a lot about it. And so we do look at that extensively. The lender requires the sponsor to do extensive study and appraisal on these real estate valuations, including demographics. So you want to be, I would argue, in the higher end demographics. There's money to be made everywhere in B and C class properties, but what we found to be the safest historically, and most of our clients are kind of older and at the end of their real estate careers, as I said, we want to have a stable experience for them with a little appreciation. Number one, preservation of capital, don't lose money. Number two, cash flow. That's obviously very important to a lot of folks. And number three, appreciation. But appreciation, you notice, is third. We want it to increase in value, hopefully beyond inflation, but that's not the primary goal here. So I've laid out quite a bit of information for you. You can contact me if you have a general question about anything I've said. I usually give a reminder, but I see that you know that you can ask questions online through whatever avenue you're using. And so now is a good time since I'm available, but feel free to reach out to me directly. There is my email and direct line phone number. Happy to talk to you. I'm the least salesy salesperson you'll ever meet, because if it makes sense, it makes sense. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. It's really that simple. And I'm not going to try to convince you otherwise. What I can tell you is when you're ready to do an exchange, to get out of California, defer your tax, get out of property management headaches, the DSTs work exceptionally well. And with that, I think we're at questions, yes?
Okay. Thank you, Adam. Appreciate it. And so some of you, if you're on YouTube, you know what to do. If you are watching from AOAUSA.com, there is the blue help bubble on the bottom right side. And if you type your question in there, they'll get that question over to us. And I think you did say something about you can't evict people for no fault reason.
No fault,
you can.
Be a reason, yeah.
Well, there's at fault and no fault.
Oh, then you're going above my head then.
Yeah, so
sorry about that.
It depends on your circumstance. So you may have shocked people. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
But I think but what he's saying, I know what you're saying. You're saying that it's getting increasingly difficult to evict people for things other than non-payment of rent.
Right.
I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah, apologies if I misstated that.
And while we're getting questions in here, I noticed that the polling is trending our way a little bit with Prop 33. So we have swung some votes. A lot of advertising dollars have been spent to help people understand the lie that Prop 33 is. But it's still 1 point. We're at a 1 point deficit still right now. And anyway, so that's a Prop 33 thing. And like New York City, 5 years ago, they enacted something similar. Property values are down there 34%, where other real estate in the same area appreciated 23%. Anyway, I say that because we got to fight this thing. You got to get the word out, and not as a scare thing, like now is the time to sell. It's not that. It's more, hey, let's fight this. And so many of you have fought with us. You've given contributed to the AOA PAC. We've been able to do so many the yard signs, billboard, digital billboards, banners. There's been so much that we've been able to do, and so much we see that you've been empowered and you've been able to share and really make the difference there. So thank you so much. Here we are. So just buying a little time to get questions in the chat. Here we go. Charles, since DSTs conclude in 3 to 5 years and must be rolled over into another DST, aren't the expenses high, and how does an owner mitigate these never-ending expenses?
Charles, that's a good question. And what I can tell you is that there's rather complex details that go into the costs and fees and what we call in our business load. But let me make it real simple. When you buy and sell real estate, there's costs associated with it. Obviously, selling commission, if there's a loan payoff or an early penalty, title, escrow, etc. All of those same things apply in a DST. They're no different, other than because they're much larger properties, the actual percentages tend to be lower. 5 or 6% is a normal selling commission, for example. The sponsors take a 1 to 3% acquisition fee. Why? Because they're buying $100 million property, so the number tends to get smaller. But yes, you could be rolling over into either another DST or buying your own real estate, and that is going to trigger those same costs. In a DST, put simply, most loads or costs are around 6-7%. I'm saying if you have $1 million property, you list it with a 5.5% commission to your broker, and you've got 2% or 1.5% closing expenses, that's that 6%, and it's built into the price. Obviously, the escrow distributes it. So if you have that in your mind, a 6 or 7% is kind of normal for buying and selling real estate. In a DST, it's a little higher. And why is it higher? It's higher because it's sold through this broker-dealer network I mentioned, which has a lot of requirements. But the simple math is that 6 or 7%, it's going to look more like 9%, 8%, generally under 10. So you're paying 2 or 3 points higher than you would if you bought your own asset. I would argue, though, that while it is more expensive, there's a lot of value that you get in return. First of all, you're owning a small part of something massive, as we've discussed. And of course, they're taking care of all that administration and what they call asset management, overseeing the property. And there's a lot of due diligence. You know, the lender requires it, smart sponsors do it, the smart broker dealers like myself do it. It means making sure everything is kosher and solid on the property, and through independent third-party reporting. People come in and do an extensive property condition report. Engineers look at the property. Obviously, appraisals are done. Environmental studies are done. Sonic studies are done. It's really quite amazing how much work goes into making sure it's a solid investment. So I could argue that extra 2 or 3 points is worth it. But that's the quick answer to your question is, yes, you may end up having to buy another asset, and there is going to be cost associated with it. But again, you're getting a real value for that slightly higher cost.
Gotcha. All right. And then can you talk about the step and the benefits to doing a 1031 exchange into a DST, then into 721?
Yeah, a lot of talk about that in recent years. There's been discussion about eliminating 1031 from the tax code for years. Again, I've been in the industry 20 years, and it's come up somewhat seriously in the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration, and that's it. The talk is that, well, what if they get rid of 1031? And at one point there was some discussion about that. Never made it to what's called the Green Book, which is when the president, whoever's in office, gives a recommendation to Congress what they want to see in the budget. Never even made it to that step. Then it has to go into the budget. Then it has to be negotiated between both houses. And as we all know, that pretty much nothing ever gets done. So it's not, in my opinion, a real big risk. And financially for the government, they would arguably get less money if they eliminated 1031. That doesn't make sense to a lot of people. And that's because studies were done that about 80% of people end up not exchanging before their death. They end up paying the tax. So we're really only talking about 20% of the smart people who are continuing to defer until their death. That's revenue that the federal government's not seeing, but you're really only chasing that 20%. If you eliminated 1031, many believe, it would slow down velocity of transactions, sales. People wouldn't sell because they have to pay the tax. Even if in the end they might have done it anyway. As a result, could generate less revenue for the Treasury, and that's why when these studies and these 2 times that it was somewhat serious when it came up, it was quashed. But President Biden, a few years ago, when he was in his first year of his term, said something once to the reporters, and that was the extent of it. Again, it never went into the formal Green Book, it never went into a budget, but he did mention it, and a lot of people got worried. One of the solutions was to have a REIT, an REIT, Real Estate Investment Trust, set up so that a 721 exchange could be completed if 1031 were eliminated. So what does that mean? When a REIT, and these are the sponsor's own REITs that they started discussing and setting up, in some cases, some already had REITs. If a REIT acquires your property, whether it's your property now or a DST interest, instead of giving you cash for the sale and doing an exchange in the traditional way, you could do a 721 exchange and receive shares of the REIT of equal value in return for your real estate, and the REIT then owns your asset. So you're swapping out your direct ownership of the property for indirect ownership via a REIT, Real Estate Investment Trust, which may own other properties as well. Once you own a REIT, you own shares in a company that owns real estate. And while they are required to pass through 90% of tax benefits and income to their shareholders, it cannot be exchanged, meaning once you sell your REIT shares, you're taxed. That capital gain that you built up is immediately triggered. This could be a good thing or a bad thing. If you want to own maybe a more diversified portfolio, either way you're passive, and you want to cash out maybe slower, potentially you could sell shares of your REIT over time. So that would be an advantage for some people. Most of my clients in their 70s or older, they want to continue to keep their money in deeded real estate, have their heirs receive the step up in basis, and then they can continue either owning real estate or sell it tax-free. With a REIT, the problem is if you're still around and it was the right time to sell at a profit, you're still going to continue to own those shares unless you decide to sell if there's a market. So 721s are available through many sponsors. A couple of them require you to sell to their REIT, which I will not recommend. I dislike that strategy very much. Some will give you an option and say, hey, if our REIT buys this property, you can defer your taxes one last time. We're going to give you shares of our REIT. And when you sell those shares, then you're going to be taxed. If you don't want to do that, we'll give you cash and you can do a traditional 1031 exchange. And that's what makes sense financially for 90% of my clients. But there is a lot of noise and discussion, and it all started a few years ago with really just a comment at an informal press conference. He later said, by the way, President Biden, okay, maybe what we'll do is limit the ability to defer taxes up to $500,000 for married couples, $250,000 for individuals, just like the home ownership 121 exemption. So that was the second time he was talking to a group of reporters. And again, all of that got quashed because it just financially makes no sense. But 721s are available. Very rare that anybody I'm dealing with wants to take advantage of it. And there are disadvantages to it, just like any other investment.
All right, Glenda, can you explain purchases with a 1031 exchange, i.e. acquisition period, identified period, length, and are there minimum amounts?
Good questions all. I'll be brief. I think we're doing okay on time. But number one, when you sell your real estate, you can't touch the funds. The IRS says if you have what's called constructive use of funds, you're taxed. You receive the money, even if it were a check that you didn't cash, for example. Of course, everything's done on wires these days. But bottom line, your money needs to move to an accommodator. They're like a second escrow. They basically hold the funds between the sale and the purchase. You have then 45 days to identify what you're going to purchase. And there's several rules about identification. Most people use the 3 property rule. You say, I'm going to buy one of these 3 properties. There are a couple of other options if you want to nominate more than 3 properties. But you need to make that decision within 45 days. One catch, if you will, to this is sometimes you're not sure you're going to be able or want to buy a property within 45. You go under contract, you have your inspector look, and suddenly there's a huge mold issue. So it's a challenge. It's a bit of a risk. Once you've identified these properties, you have to actually close and purchase within 180 days of the close of your escrow, not an additional, but inclusive of the 45 days. So that's the basic time limit that's required. That's for IRS 1031. Whether it's a DST or your own real estate, doesn't matter. It's the same tax code. It's been in the tax code since 1922. We're on 102 years. It's changed a little bit over the years, but interestingly, not that much. And it makes sense. It keeps your money invested in the real estate markets, keeps getting a return for you, which of course is taxable income for the government. And I really don't see 1031 going away anytime soon. Your other question, a little unrelated, was the minimum. Most of the sponsors in a DST will state a minimum of $100,000, but because they can take 499 investors, they actually can have very flexible. I've had people with as little as 50,000 left over from another exchange and put that money into a DST to kind of test the waters. So you have a lot of options when it comes to minimums.
Great. All right. And then Cherry here, does the anticipated 4% annual return include fees paid at purchase?
Yeah, it does. Year one is when you have those front-end load costs, the broker-dealer fees I mentioned, the extra 1.5, 2 points, the acquisition fee for the sponsor, etc. All that's baked into, that's a net number, around 4% usually in the first year, 4 to 5 I've seen. And that includes all those costs and fees. So that is a net number to you. Again, on $1 million investment of equity, your cash on cash 4% would generate $40,000 in annual income. It is distributed monthly, usually via direct deposit. So you'd get your check once a month, or you'd get your direct deposit once a month. And that's net of everything. When the 1099 comes out and that $40,000 is reported to the IRS, you're going to have a slew of deductions, just as you do now on your existing real estate. If you watch your tax return closely, you have a Schedule E where each of your assets is on a separate schedule. A DST is just another asset on that same schedule, same depreciation schedule, same deductions, etc. So you get all those benefits.
Great. Yeah. So
Go ahead.
Glenda's just sharing that she's done lots of the 1031s. She's just hasn't done the DST yet. So
yeah, it's a big decision. Again, my job is to educate. I really feel like advise and educate is what I do. Glenda, if you'd like, you've seen my number. I'm sure it's somewhere. There it is. And you've got my email and website. Reach out to me and we can talk about it. I'll show you what they look like. I'm not allowed to come on here and generally solicit or promote a specific DST. Again, that's not allowed in this industry. But that's the whole point of the consultation. There's no cost or obligation. You could do it over the phone or Zoom. I'm based in Southern California. I have clients really all over mostly the Western Seaboard, and some people who've moved east. As you heard earlier, I'm a California boy, but we can sit down and talk, and I can tell you, you can ask more questions, see if it's worth it to you or not.
All right, Adam, thank you so much for sharing with us. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And yeah, we got a lot of different things going on, so hopefully we'll catch you either in person or online next week. And hope you have a great weekend. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.